Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Today we look at some of the top compliance stories for the week ending Saturday, March 8th. Our first story today comes to us from Christianity Today, of all places, which has a very provocative lead article entitled, "Making the World Safe for Bribery." Yes, Christianity Today accuses the Trump administration of making the world safe for bribery. Trump's changes open the door for Americans to normalize corruption merely as the cost of doing business. No word on whether he will allow a tax deduction for paying a bribe. But when Christianity Today says you're doing bad things, you need to listen to what they have to say because they're a powerful voice in the world's Christian community. Next up, from Reuters, a German court says EY is not liable for damages in the Wirecard suit. This came out early last week, and it held that EY Germany cannot be held liable for damages in a lawsuit from former Wirecard shareholders over its allegedly flawed audits of the now-defunct payment company. EY faced considerable fallout from the 2020 collapse of Wirecard, one of Europe's biggest ever accounting scandals, including a 2-year ban on taking new audits for companies of public interest. The auditing company could not be held liable because its reports on Wirecard did not qualify as public capital market information. Boy, what a twisted logic to get to a non-liability finding. So, EY, of course, says the claim is unfounded. Yeah, how about that? Next up, from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, Richard Vandefort reports that the DOJ has cited Trump's order on suspending FCPA enforcement and investigation as a reason to delay the trial of two Cognizant technology senior executives who were alleged to have engaged in bribery and corruption, which led to the company getting into trouble several years ago. This case has enormous interest, and it has been around literally forever as it's over 6 years old. So you might wonder why we are still putzing around with this. And the court has ordered the parties to brief the court by this coming Monday as to what the proper remedy might be. The defendants have waived any argument under the Speedy Trial Act. I'm not sure you can waive constitutional rights, but they have done so. Clearly, they believe that the Trump Department of Justice will dismiss these charges outright. And frankly, if the DOJ asks for 6 months, they probably should be dismissed under the Constitution requirement for a speedy trial. Next up, from the New York Times Deal Book, in an article entitled "Gaming Out Trump's Next Tariff Moves," this came in the middle of a levying of tariffs of Mexico and Canada and China. Mexico and Canada at 20%, and then 2 days later pulling back from that. So I've been talking about what's going to be your export control and sanctions response, but what's going to be your business operations response, and how can you plan for such inanity and chaos? You're going to have a robust risk management system and use it robustly. Our next article is from the Financial Times, which reports that Deloitte has now linked year-end bonuses to office attendance on a return-to-work basis. So companies are getting serious about forcing employees to return to the office, and Deloitte is now going to evaluate that as part of your overall discretionary year-end bonus. And it may even go to the evaluation of you as an employee. I want to pair the Wall Street Journal article with an article from the Financial Times, which did a more detailed reporting on the Trump backtrack on the Canada-Mexico tariffs. And he's expanded, or rather suspended, all of this for 1 month. You have to wonder, what's the end game here if you set a tariff to which hurts American businesses and they have to respond to, and then 2 days later you suspend it going forward. Someone needs to think through all of this on a go-forward basis. Next up from the Grist. Corruption has infected the fight against climate change. Bribery, theft, conflicts of interest, and other forms of corruption are hampering global efforts to fight climate change and protect the environment. That's according to a new study by Transparency International, which reveals that countries that experience high levels of corruption often bypass environmental laws to exploit natural resources and rely on violence to silence resistors. The violence is often directed at indigenous peoples. Corruption has always existed and may always exist, but at the same time we have tools to stop corruption, except, of course, here in the United States, where we have suspended FCPA investigation and enforcement. According to the TI report, countries that support democratic principles like freedom of expression and assembly are better protected from corruption. Query, once again, what does that mean in the United States? Access to information is important. So, for instance, last year, the Dominican Republic's score improved on previous reports after the country implemented data and collaboration practices to address corruption. Russia, on the other hand, has shown increased corruption of late, with a report showing the invasion of Ukraine has deepened authoritarianism that suppresses criticism of the government. Indigenous communities, long stewards of biodiversity, have been some of the most heavily punished. Those without protection frequently fall victim to illegal logging, mining, and animal trafficking. Next up, from the Wall Street Journal, once again, Risk and Compliance Journal, once again, Richard Mandefort reporting with another really interesting article. This one is on the new head of the EEOC, who is going to go against companies which follow Title VII. So it's going to be interesting to see if the EEOC becomes the equivalent of firemen in Fahrenheit 451, that instead of prosecuting companies that engage in racial discrimination, she's going to prosecute companies that actually engage in affirmative action. She said that any policy that takes into account a worker's race, ethnicity, or sex when offering an opportunity is not legal. Well, she hasn't read the EEO or Title VII in quite some time, if that's what she believes. Next up from payments.com, a very interesting article on how back office leaders are selling the C-suite on risk and compliance. With regulatory and cyber risk landscapes becoming increasingly complex, the same obviously is true for financial crime tactics, that organizations are the challenges in convincing the C-suite that compliance is not a cost center, but a critical enabler of growth, efficiency, and competitive advantage. That's certainly something I'm talking about, and I hope you'll check out my blogs to find out more. And finally, Meta has to face a lawsuit claiming that it prefers cheaper workers and pays foreign workers on HB1 visas less than United States workers. This article comes to us from Reuters, and it points out a huge inconsistency in what the tech company titans are doing with the Trump administration, and while they are eviscerating the American workforce. For 10 is a special production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, our network sponsor is Ethico, and they've got a great new service offering for you, a middle manager's toolkit. We've linked to it in the show notes, and it's available to you at no cost. Many companies struggle with getting information to middle managers, which allows them to be the first line of response in a speak-up culture. And Ethisphere has answered this challenge by putting together a middle manager's toolkit. Check it out in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you'll check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency.